Hello Orchid friends, how are you? Welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time watching my video, my channel is all about orchids. From what orchids I have, how I grow them, my thoughts on certain orchid topics, to what orchids in my collection are blooming, etc. So if you want to follow along my orchid hobby adventure, please consider subscribing to my channel and turn on the notification. Today in this video, we're going to look at a couple Catasetum orchids in my collection. For this genre of orchids, there are Cycnoches, Catasetum, and then more Modies. But for the sake of this video, as well as for simplicity, I'm gonna just call them Catasetum orchid in general. So first up, we're gonna look at my first one, and this one we're gonna go back in time to February 2019. So at the time, it was putting out a new growth. However, I did not like what I was seeing about the size of its pot and the amount of media that it had. It was drying out so much last summer, so I knew I wanted to give them a repot. But I was waiting for the right time, and I think at that time was a good time because the new growth was just coming out and the new roots were emerging, but they weren't that long yet. So I thought that would be a good time. So I decided to do that, and before I took them out of the pot, I had to soak them really well because at the time, this orchid did not receive any water at all, so I know I had to soak it for a long enough of a time so that the moss will come off easily. This orchid didn't really have that many viable roots coming out of the dormancy. In fact, I had to trim off a lot of the dead tissues because after it was soaked, I used my finger to press on them. I didn't really find any good viable roots from last growing cycle from last year. And because this type of orchids really need water in spring and summertime to grow, so I decided to continue to use sphagnum moss. But I did also prepare some hydrocorn for aeration so that it's not just moss in case I packed it too tightly. And this is kind of how I go about repot this orchid. I use a soldering iron as usual to make holes on the cups that I want to use for my orchids. I couldn't find any smaller cup at the time, so I went with a 16-ounce cup. And for those of you who haven't used soldering irons to drill holes, make sure you have some wet sponge or some wet paper towels laying around because the tips of it sometimes will get plastic on it and you really need to quickly wipe it off. Otherwise, you may have you may damage your soldering iron or have difficulty using in the future. I decided to drill holes at the bottom because I am going to still use double cup method to allow flexibility. If I need more water at the bottom, I can kind of treat it as a semi-hydro method. Otherwise, I would just let the excess water drain out of the holes at the bottom. And the moss that I use is something I just purchased on Amazon. It's nothing spectacular, but I think it's good enough. It's soft enough. It's much better than the sphagnum moss I purchased from local garden center. Anyway, so the bottom of the cup I put just moss, and then the middle layer is where I use a bit of hydrocorn in between, and then I sprinkled about 10 time release fertilizer pellets. And in terms of positioning the orchid, you want to put the older pseudobulbs closer to the edge so that you allow more room for new growths to grow. And that's kind of similar, well actually exactly the same logic as you would for repotting your Cattleya orchids. So here is the finished product of the repot of our number 1 orchid today. And coming up, we're going to take a look at my number 2 and number 3. and also going back in time to February 2019. So number 2 at the time was putting out a new growth, and this is what it looked like in April 2019. At that time, this was already after the repot. When we look at number 3, we will look at the repot of number 2 and number 3 at the same time. But overall, I think number 2 also responded pretty well to the repot, because if I had done it later than when I did it, the roots would have grown so long or longer that I may not be able to totally save this orchid, or I guess repot the orchid without damaging its roots. So I think I repotted these orchids at the right time. However, my doubt about the repot is the cup size that I use, but we can talk about that later. So here is number 3. In February 2019, it was showing signs of putting out 2 new growths. So I decided to repot them. Soaking them, again, this is just for ease of removal of excess or unwanted old moss. But then it was also a good time for me to have a better, easier way to see whether any existing old roots were viable. And guess what? I found very little viable roots from last year. And this could be a characteristic of this type of orchid, because they have to go through winter dormancy. Sometimes I think everything just dries out, and I think it's typical that older roots will simply die off and let the new roots from new growths take over. To be extra sure, I even let them sit for about 24 hours bare root, just so that I could see for myself whether these older roots that I cut away were indeed dead roots. And they were mostly dead, because all they left was just the outside filament, and inside of it, if you press on it, it was simply hollow and soft. So this is what they look like after the repot. So I took all 3 of them. I took a photo of all 3 of them together, but number 2 and number 3 were repotted on the same day, and I had done number 1 a couple days prior. So here is what number 3 looked like a couple weeks after the repot. So this is mid-March 2019. At that time, the roots were growing really interestingly. I love seeing how the roots grow. And this is number 2. At the time, they were growing pretty okay. And then came April 2019. Number 3 continued to grow more roots. So that was a very good sign that I chose the right time to repot it. Now back to the cup size. Because the cups were much bigger, I couldn't find any 12 ounce or even 8 ounce cup that's wide enough but hollow enough, so I could only use the 16 ounce cup, which I think is probably taller than their liking. Another thing is, I've checked with a couple experts in my network. They have grown these type of orchids for quite some time. They told me, and not that I don't trust them, but if you can share with me your experience, that would be great. And that is, they said when the new roots are growing or the new growths are growing, you don't want to introduce too much water too quickly, because new roots sometimes, when they're too wet, they stop growing. I don't know if that's true, but for these orchids, in August, they grow lots of leaves, they grow okay, but their pseudables are not as big. I suspect that's because they didn't receive enough nutrients or fertilizer. So that's something I'll have to adjust and increase the amount of for the next year. Another thing that I'm thinking about doing differently with these orchid is, for next year, I may have to find a way to increase their light exposure. Maybe I do have to put them outside. Maybe I do have to put them right underneath the grow light. I haven't decided what to do yet, but back in August 2019, they were growing pretty okay. They were right on the windowsill, but because it's east facing, so I think that maybe they needed even more sun than that. And then in October 2019, that was the autumn in my environment. They were starting to shed leaves. So hopefully 2020 they'll grow better, but this is what they have done in 2019. This is all I have for you today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you would like to get more orchid related videos from my channel, please subscribe and turn on the notification. I want to wish you happy growing, and I will talk to you in my next video. Ciao!